Hello everyone, thank you for listening. My name is Jacob Bender, and today I want to provide a brief introduction to some Buddhist ideas relevant to a paper I recently published. In light of my recent publication, I present here an introduction to a few key ideas from Mahayana Buddhism, and especially Chan Buddhism. My paper is titled Mirroring Omnipresent Suffering, a Chan Buddhist Alternative to Phronesis. In it, I compared the Chan Buddhist understanding of compassion with the virtue of phronesis, or practical wisdom. In the Chan Buddhist tradition, and in Mahayana Buddhism generally, many of these Buddhists understood that compassion was grounded in the capacity to perceive all situations as participating in, or we could say as embodying, the same omnipresent structure of reality. This structure, I use that word loosely, this structure of reality, it is referred to as sunyata, or emptiness. What it denotes is that reality is not made up of independent things, or in a more technical language, that there are not substances or essences underlying change. Everything is interrelated and overlapping. In the Chan Buddhist view, if we understand how reality is characterized by emptiness, or the non-self-existence of all things, then persons also possess the ability to spontaneously respond to situations with compassion. There are quite a few topics I could discuss today, but what I want to do here in this just brief amount of time, instead of summarizing the whole paper, I just want to introduce people to an important theme in Mahayana Buddhism. It is a theme that is especially important for the Chan Buddhists, and section 2 of my paper, I do just talk about this a bit. Today, all I want to do is present a brief introduction to the Buddhist account of emptiness and its relationship to compassion by discussing some passages from an important sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra. The Vimalakirti Sutra is a text that some scholars believe was written around the year 100 CE. Apart from the stories that describe Vimalakirti's compassion, there are some other important themes to take note of that are relevant to moral philosophy. For example, this sutra departs from earlier forms of Buddhism in suggesting that everyday people and non-monks can engage with Buddhist philosophy and practices and become enlightened. You do not have to literally leave home life and become a monk to practice Buddhism. This is who Vimalakirti is. He is a lay person, but he is portrayed as enlightened in this sutra. Another important theme in the text, and especially in chapter 7 of this sutra, is that the sutra argues that women can become enlightened and that there is no difference between men and women in their potential to learn Buddhism and reach enlightenment. In this and in many other respects, this is a rather iconoclastic philosophical text. The stories I will focus on here have to do with Vimalakirti's compassion and how the sutra describes the motivation for his compassion. His motivation is what the sutra calls his sickness. The beginning chapters of the Vimalakirti Sutra present us with a story. The Buddha and all the other various Buddhas are worried about the wise man Vimalakirti, and they are worried because he is supposedly sick. In these first few chapters, the text introduces us both to Vimalakirti, who is again the enlightened layman, and, through the various dialogues, the Mahayana Buddhist teachings generally. The Buddha wants someone to check on Vimalakirti to figure out why he is sick. But of all the various students and bodhisattvas, only the Buddha's top student feels like he is capable of asking Vimalakirti about his health. When we finally get to the point where Vimalakirti explains why he is sick, this is, in part, how he answers. Manjusri, my sickness comes from ignorance and the thirst for existence, and it will last as long as do the sicknesses of all living beings. Were all living beings to be free from sickness, I also would not be sick. Why? Manjusri, for the Bodhisattva, the world consists only of living beings, and sickness is inherent in living in the world. Were all living beings free of sickness, the Bodhisattva also would be free of sickness. Although there is much more happening in this passage, and I can't talk about all of that here in just this brief introduction, in this very initial part of Vimalakirti's answer, it alludes to one of the more important features of the Buddhist compassion. The text suggests that Vimalakirti is sick because all other people are sick And overcoming this sickness is not possible unless everyone is free of this sickness, or really free of ignorance. So what's happening here? Underlying Vimalakirti's answer is really just the Buddhist account of no self and emptiness, the emptiness of all things. Really what I described earlier as that omnipresent, loosely calling it a structure of reality. So later in this same chapter, we get an even more explicit answer to what's happening for Vimalakirti. So here it is. As the passage states, thus, recognizing in his own suffering the infinite sufferings of these living beings, the Bodhisattva correctly contemplates these living beings and resolves to cure all sickness. As for these living beings, there is nothing to be applied and there is nothing to be removed. One has only to teach them the Dharma for them to realize the basis from which sickness arises. What is this basis? It is object perception. So from the Mahayana Buddhist perspective, people all throughout the world, throughout existence, are sick because they are suffering from ignorance. This ignorance is specifically the belief that there are distinct and independent objects in the world. In particular, it is the belief that there are independent selves or that other people are independent. As soon as we would see how all things are not independent, then we would no longer be ignorant. But there was also a flip side to this, and this is what this story is talking about. An enlightened person, like Vimalakirti, is sick because of their great compassion. Insofar as persons can perceive the interdependence of all things, they would recognize that they are not an independent thing or ego. Why are they still sick then? It is because others are sick. And the enlightened Bodhisattva views all peoples as internally related to each other. So on this point, this is what I want to explain in the next few slides. What do we mean by emptiness and no self? And I have some illustrations to help with this. So, if Vimalakirti is so wise, then why is he also sick? So on this slide, I have some simple illustrations that are, I think, very useful for understanding what's happening in Buddhism in a very simple way. But the answer is that for Vimalakirti, he views all other peoples as internal to himself. He sees their suffering, or as the passage states, their infinite sufferings, as his own. These illustrations come from a very useful essay by a scholar named Tom Kasulis. The essay is titled The Mosaic and the Jigsaw Puzzle. In ignorance, people see themselves and others as external to each other, or they see each other as externally related. They view themselves as independent, like metaphysical substances or essences. This is what the illustration on the left shows us. In interpreting situations where people are independent, we would see them as merely externally related. For the Buddhist, and especially for Vimalakirti as this sutra describes it, the more accurate understanding of suffering and of the kind of beings that we are is like the illustration on the right. As is frequently stated in this sutra and many others, the subject-object dualism for the Buddhists is a false dualism. It's ignorant. In reality, there's always overlap. People are internally related to their world and vice versa. This is why Vimalakirti is sick. It is his compassion and his correct view of reality, basically. In abandoning the view that there are distinct and independent objects, he views the suffering of others as internal to himself. So here again, here are some illustrations that will make it easier to understand, more simple to understand. So what does a Buddhist hope to achieve through their cultivation practices and being educated in the Buddhist tradition? What would it mean to be an enlightened and compassionate bodhisattva from the perspective of this sutra? Well, as it states in this sutra, we would view all things as internally related to each other, and we would act in accord with these insights. We would not view ourselves as independent beings, but as constantly changing focal points of relationships. We would be internally related to all other peoples. In this way, compassion and love are not mere feelings. Compassion is instead, from this enlightened perspective, a form of conduct that realizes how all people are, at the most fundamental level, internally related to each other. So again, these illustrations, the top right, a more macro level view of how we could think of the world. Compassion and love then would help us elucidate these internal relationships. They would help us realize that all human beings are actually internally related to each other. There are many other Mahayana Buddhist texts that present the Buddhist teachings of no self and the compassion that results from this ability to see all things as empty of a self nature. For example, in my essay, I also draw on the Nirvana Sutra as it makes similar claims about compassion. Although there is a very long history of Mahayana Buddhism developing their ideas, they have debates, internal self-critique. What my paper specifically talks about is the way early Chan Buddhists understood emptiness and compassion. The early Chan Buddhists in China used the Tiyong distinction, or the body function distinction, to describe what it means for things to be empty of a self nature. Generally, this distinction is similar to a parts-whole distinction. If you are interested, you could read my paper where I go into more detail about this specifically from the Chan Buddhist perspective. The previous illustrations will help with making sense of these Buddhist ideas. Generally speaking, though, this brief introduction about emptiness and compassion is relevant to many of the different Mahayana Buddhist traditions. So hopefully, in that respect, it will be helpful to everyone listening. The Vimalakirti Sutra is one of the earlier Buddhist texts, but the Buddhist tradition does not stop here. These ideas are developed in different ways throughout history, but with this small introduction, I hope that any scholars that are interested in these ideas will be able to grasp the Buddhist philosophy more easily. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to this presentation. And for those who want some further readings, below in this slide, I have some. Thank you again.